The 1980s were the most rebellious, chaotic, and stylish decade in history. Why? Because subcultures ruled the streets, shaping music, fashion, and identity. In this video, we'll uncover 20 forgotten subcultures from the 1980s that shaped a generation. From punks to preppies, these groups defined the 80s, and might define you too. Stick around, your favorite might just make the list. 1. Punks. What comes to mind when you think of rebellion? For many in the 1980s, it was the punks. Picture this: mohawks defying gravity, ripped jeans held together by safety pins, and leather jackets covered in spikes and patches. But punks weren't just about the look, they were a movement. Emerging from the gritty streets of London and New York in the late 70s, punks exploded into the 80s as a counterculture rejecting conformity and embracing chaos. Their anthem, the raw, unapologetic sounds of bands like The Clash, Sex Pistols, and Dead Kennedys. Their message? Question everything. But punk wasn't just music, it was a lifestyle. They gathered in underground clubs, zine circles, and even squatted in abandoned buildings, creating a community that thrived on independence. And let's be honest, didn't we all secretly want to channel that punk attitude at some point? Yet, as the decade went on, mainstream fashion began to borrow elements of punk, diluting its edge. Does that mean punk died, or did it evolve, morphing into new subcultures like hardcore and grunge? Stick around, because the ripple effects of punk might surprise you. 2. New Romantics. While punks were tearing it all down, another group was building something dreamy and decadent. Enter the New Romantics, a subculture that transformed the nightclubs of London into otherworldly realms of fashion and music. Think velvet suits, pirate shirts, and makeup that could rival a runway model's. What made the New Romantics so compelling was their bold embrace of artistry. They weren't just playing dress-up, they were creating walking works of art. Their soundtrack, synth-heavy anthems from bands like Duran Duran, Spandau Ballet, and Visage. Have you ever heard Fade to Grey? It's hauntingly beautiful and perfectly encapsulates this era. The movement was about more than just style. It was a response to the bleakness of the late 70s, a rejection of austerity in favor of fantasy. But was it sustainable? As the 80s progressed, the opulence of New Romanticism faded, making way for the polished pop of the mid-decade. Still, its legacy lives on every time a music video dares to be as much about visuals as it is about sound. 3. Goths. Let's turn the lights down low and step into the shadowy world of the Goths. With their jet black attire, dark eyeliner, and love of the macabre, the Goth subculture was as enigmatic as it was misunderstood. But have you ever wondered what drew people to embrace this haunting aesthetic? In the 1980s, Goth wasn't just a look, it was a feeling. Inspired by post-punk bands like The Cure, Susie and the Banshees, and Bauhaus, Goth music wove together melancholic lyrics and eerie melodies. It wasn't just about sadness, it was a celebration of the beautiful and the tragic. But Goths didn't just listen to music, they lived it. From smoky underground clubs to candlelit bedrooms, Goth culture became a sanctuary for those who felt like outsiders. And their fashion, it was theatrical, almost Victorian, with lace, corsets, and flowing black coats. Yet, the question remains, was Goth just a phase? Or did it tap into something timeless? As we explore further, you'll see how this subculture's influence creeps into everything from modern fashion to Halloween aesthetics. 4. Skaters. Can you hear it? The clatter of a skateboard hitting pavement, the whoosh of wheels on concrete. The 1980s were the golden era of skateboarding, and skaters weren't just athletes, they were renegades. With their ripped jeans, oversized tees, and checkerboard vans, skaters carved out a unique identity. But skating was more than tricks. It was a rebellion against authority. No skate park? No problem. Skaters turned urban landscapes into their playground, from empty pools to abandoned lots. It wasn't just about the sport, it was about freedom. And then there were the videos. Have you ever seen the raw energy of a Powell Peralta skate tape? These underground videos showcased gravity-defying tricks and punk soundtracks, cementing skate culture as a DIY phenomenon. Skaters weren't waiting for permission, they were creating their own rules. By the end of the decade, skating had gone mainstream, but its soul remained fiercely independent. Today, every kickflip and ollie owes something to the 80s skater ethos. 5. Mods, 80s revival. When you think of mods, you might picture the swinging 60s, scooters, and sharp suits. But in the 1980s, this iconic subculture made a comeback, reinvented for a new generation. Why? Because some styles are just too cool to stay buried. The revival was fueled by bands like The Jam, whose energetic rock rekindled the mod spirit. Young people across the UK embraced the clean-cut look, tailored jackets, skinny ties, and polished shoes. And let's not forget the scooters, adorned with mirrors and chrome, making every ride feel like a parade. But mods weren't just about looking good, they were about living well. They frequented all-night dance clubs, spinning Northern Soul records and sipping espresso. It was a lifestyle that balanced sophistication with rebellion. Yet like every revival, it begged the question, how much of this was authentic and how much was nostalgia? As the decade rolled on, the mod revival faded, but its legacy persisted in fashion and music. 6. Preppies. Let's flip the script from rebellion to refinement. Preppies were the golden children of the 1980s, radiating an aura of privilege, order, and Ivy League sophistication. Think pastel polos with popped collars, khaki pants, and a touch of Ralph Lauren flair. But here's the question, was preppy style just about looking polished, or did it symbolize something deeper? Preppies represented an ideal, one of success, ambition, and upward mobility. They weren't just wearing brands, they were wearing a lifestyle. Their wardrobes were filled with cable knit sweaters, boat shoes, and blazers, ready for a yacht party or a weekend at the country club. But there was a paradox. While the look screamed exclusivity, it became wildly popular. Movies like The Breakfast Club and Pretty in Pink showcased preppies as the elite foil to rebellious outsiders. And soon, even those outside the upper crust were emulating the style. Why? Because everyone wanted a piece of the dream. Did preppy culture fade away? Not quite. It evolved, and its echoes can still be seen in modern fashion. But in the 1980s, preppies didn't just dress for success, they embodied it. 7. Yuppies. From preppy to yuppie, the young urban professional. If preppies were about aspiration, yuppies were about execution. Picture sleek suits, brick-sized cell phones, and an obsession with climbing the corporate ladder. But here's the twist. Were yuppies the heroes of the American dream, or were they the villains of 1980s greed? Yuppies emerged during the economic boom of the Reagan era, thriving on ambition and materialism. They drove BMWs, dined at chic restaurants, and flaunted the latest gadgets. Movies like Wall Street immortalized the yuppie mantra, greed is good. But was it? Critics saw yuppies as shallow and self-serving, yet they represented a new kind of success story. They were young, hungry, and unapologetic about their desire for wealth. And for every detractor, there was someone inspired to hustle harder. By the end of the 80s, the yuppie dream had lost its sheen, tarnished by recessions and excess. But the question remains, did they shape the modern hustle culture we see today? 8. Breakdancers, B-boys and B-girls. Can you feel the rhythm? In the 1980s, the streets came alive with the electrifying moves of breakdancers or b-boys and b-girls. This wasn't just dance, it was an art form, a battle, and a culture. But what made breakdancing so magnetic? Originating from the Bronx and the burgeoning hip-hop scene, breakdancing combined athleticism, creativity, and fierce competition. Dancers turned the simplest spaces, sidewalks, subway stations, into stages, spinning on their heads and defying gravity. And the music? A pulsating mix of beats that fueled every move. Breakdancing wasn't just about impressing a crowd, it was about respect. Battles were fought, reputations were made, and rivalries were legendary. Movies like Breakin' and Beat Street brought the art form to mainstream audiences, but true breakdancing thrived in the underground. As the 80s ended, breakdancing faded from the spotlight, but it never truly died. Watch a dance competition today, and you'll see the legacy of b-boys and b-girls living on. 9. Metalheads. When you think of 80s music, the roar of heavy metal is impossible to ignore. Enter the Metalheads, long-haired rebels clad in leather and denim, headbanging to the sound of shredding guitars. But here's a thought, was heavy metal just noise or was it a way of life? Metalheads were fiercely loyal to their music, finding anthems of power and rebellion in bands like Metallica, Iron Maiden, and Black Sabbath. Concerts were more than shows, they were rituals. The mosh pits, the devil horns, the deafening energy, it was cathartic chaos. Their look was as bold as their sound. Leather jackets, band tees, and studded belts became their uniform. And don't forget the hair, big, wild, and untamed, just like the music. But metal wasn't all darkness and aggression. It was about community. Metalheads were misfits who found each other in a world that didn't always understand them. Even as grunge overtook the airwaves in the 90s, true metalheads kept the spirit alive. And today, metal's pulse is still as loud as ever. 10. Hipsters of the 80s. Before the word hipster became a modern cliche, its essence was alive and well in the 1980s. The original hipsters were cultural curators, people who sought out the obscure, the authentic, and the avant-garde. But what did being a hipster mean in the 80s? This subculture thrived on individuality. While others gravitated toward mass trends, hipsters dug through thrift shops, read underground literature, and listened to indie bands before they were cool. Their style was eclectic, a mix of vintage finds, bohemian influences, and a touch of irony. What set 80s hipsters apart was their intellectual edge. They weren't just dressing differently, they were questioning mainstream values, experimenting with art, and rejecting consumerism. But ironically, their niche tastes often became the next big thing, sparking trends they sought to avoid. Today's hipsters owe a lot to these 80s trailblazers. But here's the question, was it truly about individuality, or was it just another way to stand out? The debate continues, but their influence on art, music, and culture is undeniable. 11. Skinheads, original movement. When you hear the term skinhead, what comes to mind? Controversy? Rebellion? The truth is, the original skinhead movement of the 1980s wasn't about hate. It was about working class pride and a deep love for music. So how did this subculture get so misunderstood? Emerging from the ska and reggae scenes of the late 70s, skinheads brought a bold, clean-cut style to the 80s. Picture boots polished to a mirror shine, rolled up jeans, suspenders, and buzz cuts. Their fashion was sharp, their attitude unapologetic, and their music, a mix of Jamaican beats and punk rock, was their heartbeat. But the story of skinheads is a tale of duality. While some celebrated unity and diversity, others adopted the look for far darker ideologies, creating a rift that still lingers today. How did one subculture split into two wildly different paths? That's a question that keeps historians and fans of the movement digging deeper. By the late 80s, the skinhead aesthetic had spread globally, and while its original spirit may have been overshadowed by controversy, its impact on fashion and music endures. 12. Rockabillies, revival movement. Let's rewind even further. The 80s weren't just about forward-thinking subcultures. They also revived the past. Enter the Rockabillies, a group that brought the slick style of the 1950s roaring back into the spotlight. But here's the twist. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was reinvention. With their pompadours, leather jackets, and cuffed jeans, Rockabilly stood out in a sea of neon and spandex. They weren't just dressing up, they were embracing a bygone era of rebellion and cool. Their soundtrack, the classic rock and roll sounds of Elvis Presley and Carl Perkins, mixed with a modern punk edge from bands like the Stray Cat. But Rockabillies weren't just about aesthetics, they were about community. Car shows, swing dances, and retro diners became their stomping grounds. It was a way of life that balanced vintage values with 80s energy. As the decade went on, the Rockabilly revival faded, but its style still pops up in modern subcultures. Maybe cool never really goes out of fashion, does it? 13. Cyberpunks. Now let's jump to the future, or at least what the 1980s thought the future might look like. Cyberpunks were a subculture born from sci-fi dreams and fears of a tech-dominated world. But here's the question, were they just predicting the future, or were they warning us about it? Inspired by books like William Gibson's Neuromancer and movies like Blade Runner, Cyberpunks imagined a world where technology and humanity collided. Their style was a blend of industrial and dystopian, dark trench coats, mirrored sunglasses, and futuristic gadgets. But cyberpunks weren't just about aesthetics. They embraced hacking, digital art, and questioning authority in a world increasingly controlled by corporations. Sound familiar? They were ahead of their time, foreshadowing modern debates about privacy, AI, and the ethics of tech. As the internet emerged in the late 80s and 90s, the cyberpunk aesthetic seeped into pop culture. And today, with cyberpunk-themed games and films still thriving, it's clear this subculture never really left. 14. Surfers. Close your eyes and picture it. The sun beating down, waves crashing against the shore, and someone effortlessly riding the curl of a perfect wave. The 1980s were the golden era of surfers, and their influence extended far beyond the beaches. Surfers weren't just athletes, they were style icons. Board shorts, graphic tees, and sun-bleached hair became the uniform of a laid-back lifestyle that everyone wanted to emulate. Brands like Quicksilver and Billabong capitalized on this, turning surf culture into a global phenomenon. But surfing was more than just a sport. It was a philosophy. Life's better at the beach wasn't just a saying, it was a way of thinking. And for those who couldn't make it to the ocean, surf culture made its way inland through music. Ever heard of the Beach Boys? Skateboarding, and even video games like California Games. By the end of the decade, surfing had firmly planted itself in pop culture, and while the surfers themselves never cared much about trends, their easygoing ethos left a permanent mark on the world. 15 Post-punks. If punk was about destruction, post-punk was about reconstruction. This subculture emerged in the early 80s, taking the raw energy of punk and combining it with experimental sounds and introspective lyrics. But here's the question, was post-punk just music, or was it an entirely new way of seeing the world? Bands like Joy Division, Talking Heads, and Susie and the Banshees led the charge, pushing boundaries with haunting melodies and thought-provoking themes. Their fans mirrored this spirit of innovation, favoring minimalist fashion, monochromatic tones, structured silhouettes, and rejecting the excesses of mainstream culture. Post-punk wasn't about fitting in, it was about standing apart. Its followers thrived in underground scenes where art, music, and philosophy collided. They were thinkers, creators, and rebels, challenging norms with every move. As the 80s wore on, post-punk evolved, giving birth to genres like new wave and goth. But its legacy lives on in modern indie and alternative music. Was it a subculture, or the foundation of something even bigger? The answer might surprise you. 16 Funksters. Can you feel the groove? The 1980s weren't just about neon lights and synthesizers. They were also home to the irresistible rhythms of funk. Funksters embraced the beats, the style, and the energy of this electrifying genre. But here's a question, was funk just music, or was it a statement? Funksters were all about flair. From vibrant suits and bold patterns to metallic fabrics and platform shoes, their fashion made a statement before they even hit the dance floor. Prince, George Clinton, and Rick James were their icons, blending funk with pop and R&B to create a sound that defined an era. But funk wasn't just about aesthetics, it was a lifestyle. Funksters gathered in nightclubs and house parties, turning every space into a celebration. Their moves? Electric slides, funky walks, and grooves so smooth you'd think gravity didn't apply to them. As the 80s progressed, funk evolved, blending with other genres like hip-hop and disco. But for the Funksters, it was never just about the music, it was about the joy of expression, the power of community, and the freedom to be unapologetically bold. Can you still hear the beat? Because funk never really dies. 17 New Wave Kids. If you were a new wave kid in the 80s, you weren't just part of a music scene, you were part of a movement. New wave wasn't about rebellion or nostalgia, it was about embracing the future. But here's the catch, what made new wave so unique was its refusal to fit into a single box. New wave kids were colorful, quirky, and experimental. Their style was a mix of oversized blazers, skinny ties, and bright geometric patterns. Hair was teased, dyed, and asymmetrical, anything to stand out. Bands like Depeche Mode, Talking Heads, and Blondie were the soundtrack to their lives, blending synth-pop, punk, and post-disco into something entirely new. New wave was about more than music though, it was a vibe. It embraced individuality, technology, and creativity in a way that felt exciting and fresh. Have you ever heard Take On Me by a-ha or Don't You Want Me by the Human League? Those tracks weren't just songs, they were anthems of a generation. By the late 80s, new wave had largely been absorbed into pop culture, but its influence lives on. The next time you see bold patterns or hear a synth-heavy beat, you'll know the new wave kids left their mark. 18 Hardcore Kids. If punk was raw, hardcore punk was relentless. Hardcore kids were the adrenaline junkies of the 1980s music scene, rejecting the mainstream and carving out a space where the music was louder, faster, and angrier. But here's the thing, hardcore wasn't just about music, it was about building a subculture from the ground up. Bands like Black Flag, Minor Threat, and Bad Brains fueled the hardcore movement with blistering riffs and lyrics that hit like a gut punch. Hardcore kids weren't passive listeners, they were active participants. Every concert was an intense experience, complete with mosh pits, stage dives, and an electrifying sense of community. The DIY ethic was at the heart of hardcore. They made their own zines, booked their own shows, and refused to sell out to commercial interests. Their look? Simple and practical. Band tees, jeans, and sneakers, ready for whatever chaos the night might bring. Hardcore punk eventually splintered into various subgenres, but its spirit of independence and rebellion remains. Whether it's in underground music scenes or modern punk movements, the echoes of those hardcore kids are impossible to ignore. 19. Ravers emerging. Before raves became synonymous with glow sticks and massive EDM festivals, they were an underground phenomenon bubbling up in the late 1980s. Ravers were pioneers of a new kind of subculture, one built around electronic music, secret locations, and a sense of collective euphoria. But what made them so captivating? Ravers were all about the experience. These were the kids who followed the beats to warehouse parties, where DJs spun hypnotic tracks that kept everyone dancing until sunrise. Their aesthetic, neon colors, baggy clothes, and accessories like whistles and glow bracelets. What set ravers apart was their philosophy. They embraced pure, peace, love, unity, and respect, creating an inclusive space where everyone could escape the pressures of the outside world. It wasn't just a party, it was a way of life. As the 90s approached, rave culture exploded, but its roots were firmly planted in the 80s. The underground energy of those early ravers laid the foundation for one of the most enduring and global subcultures. Can you still hear the bass line? It's still reverberating through time. 20. Grunge predecessors. Before grunge took over the airwaves in the 90s, its seeds were quietly being sown in the 80s. The grunge predecessors were an underground group of musicians and fans who rejected the flashy excess of the decade in favor of something raw, real, and stripped down. But here's the twist. Grunge wasn't just music, it was an attitude. Emerging from the rainy streets of Seattle, these early adopters favored flannel shirts, ripped jeans, and an unkempt look that stood in stark contrast to the polished styles of the time. Bands like Green River and the Melvins laid the groundwork, blending punk and heavy metal into something entirely new. But it wasn't just about the sound, it was about authenticity. Grunge predecessors rejected corporate culture and embraced imperfection, both in their music and their lives. They weren't trying to be cool, they were just being themselves. By the end of the 80s, grunge was ready to explode, with bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam leading the charge into the next decade. But it all started here, with a handful of misfits who dared to be different. The 1980s were a vibrant tapestry of subcultures, each leaving a lasting mark on music, fashion, and society. Which of these forgotten subcultures resonates most with you? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more nostalgic dives into the past. There's so much more to uncover.